This summer we're preaching through Forrest Church's book called Lifecraft. And in the book he talks about the fact that in any person's life we all have these different spiritual projects we're working on. The colleague project, the citizen project, the parent project, the spouse project, and this chapter in his book is called the God project. He begins it where I left off last week, talking about experiences of awe in our lives. Those moments where we lay back on the soil and look into a bed of stars and acknowledge that we are in the presence of a reality that we'll never fully understand and can never fully control. We're probably always in the presence of a reality like that, but it's knowing it that Forrest Church says is the beginning of religion. Maybe it is standing beneath a starry sky for you, or moments of terror. I can remember as a child watching as our house was about to be flooded by a creek, and the water was rising. I watched a horse float through the water in my backyard, and we were putting furniture up and putting sandbags out, and I was in awe and terror. Watching my son be born was a moment where I knew I was in the presence, in the midst of a reality that I couldn't fully understand and could never control. It's easier for me to start conversations about religion with most people by asking about their experiences of awe than it is to say, tell me about your experience of God. Because in my experience, people are much more open-minded about their awe than they are their God. That word is one of the most misunderstood, overused, heavily burdened with connotation in the English language. And what a shame. The signifier that says, this is how I will point toward the most meaningful, subtle, mysterious, creative reality in all existence that holds, sustains, and creates all things. And yet I know well that the second I use that word, it turns normally poetic, thoughtful, tolerant people into literalists. Literalists in my fundamentalist Christian friends who believe that God must be exactly as they believe it or not at all, and literalists like my fundamentalist atheist friends who believe that since God is not like that for them, it does not exist at all, and everywhere in between. No word that I know can quickly turn a person into a literalist like the word God. Which is interesting, because what most of us in this room inherited, either because we grew up in a Jewish or Christian background, or because we live in a society that is so saturated and influenced by Judeo-Christian tradition, you would think that we would have inherited what those texts and scriptures and stories and traditions actually said about God. But for the most part, we didn't. We kind of inherit what somebody told us about that, and then we had an opinion about it, and we haven't read that book in a while, but we think we know what it says, which is easy to do. But the interesting thing about that to me is that those books, those traditions, those stories actually teach of a rich tapestry, an approach to God that suggests we will never fully know or fully be able to control that reality in our lives. For one thing, what we call the Bible is a collection of stories, texts, history book, poetry, songs, family genealogies, political stories, narrations from a king's court, collected over the course of almost 1,500 or more years, edited a number of times, sometimes with conflicting stories. It's a group of people for 1,000 years or more reflecting how will we walk with the reality that calls us into holiness. And they do what humans do. They get petty about it and have strong opinions and argue. But the range of cultures included in this vast story would be as if we took St. Augustine all the way to Stephen Hawking, put their writings in one collection and said, this only says one thing. It's even bigger than that. Truth is, if you read the Bible in Hebrew and not English, it tells a different story. It actually starts with many gods, narrowing down to the Jews choosing one to whose devotion they'll give their lives. The word El or Elohim is one of the words for the holy used in ancient Hebrew language, and it shows up in the plural a lot in Genesis. Elohim, more than one God. When God says that gods will create humans in their own image, it is their image. We will create them in our image, it says. And then when humans do what they do and mess up and eat the fruit they're not supposed to eat and all of that stuff which you know well, the text says they have become like us. Us, not me. In the ancient world in Mesopotamia and other religious cultures around that area, there was a commonly held notion of a divine council of deities. And each tribe, each culture, each region would give their ultimate loyalty to one of those deities who participated in a divine council. The people that we call the Hebrew people, or the Jews, one of the names most associated with the God to whom they gave their pledge of allegiance was Yahweh. At least we think it was. Because that name, Yahweh, is what we think it is pronounced as. We're not sure. Also, the reason why we don't know is because they never wrote the whole name. They never spoke the whole name because it was too precious to say out loud. So they would write the equivalent of YHWH. I know Jews today who write G*D instead of God. There was a notion in the 200s and 300s forward that the name of God was so powerful and holy that you dare not utter it aloud. And then when English came into being, instead of saying Adonai, which is what the Jews said instead of Yahweh, because you don't say Yahweh's name, English-speaking people substituted the word Lord. So every time you read the Bible and it says the word Lord, someone who translated it saw the word Yahweh, the name of God too holy to speak, and inserted the word Lord there as a placeholder. Funny that a name about power, dominion, control, people who utter that word Lord to command and control others, it is a signifier that we know very little. In fact, the story of that name Yahweh comes from the story of Moses encountering God at the burning bush. He does exactly what most of us do. He has an experience he can't explain and then tries to explain it and control it and make it easy to put in a box. In fact, he even says to that holy voice speaking to him, "Hey, what's your name?" And if you were listening to this story 2,000 years ago, you would know why he asked that question. There was an understanding in the ancient world among the people who wrote and told these stories that if you knew a God's name, you could control it. If you could utter a God's name, you could ask it to do you favors. You could control its power. So that's why when you curse today, sometimes you say the name of a god, or you ask a god to do something. You got there. So Moses does what someone who wanted to control God would do. The voice says, "Come here." He says, "I'm here." The voice says, "I notice there's injustice. I'm going to help you and your people come out of bondage and slavery, but you have to help." And he says what we all would say, "Are you sure you mean me?" "Yeah, I mean you. I'm going with you." And he says, "Okay, great. So what's your name?" Which would have been a cue to all the people listening to that story. "So I'd like to control you and use you for my own will." And the voice speaks back to him, "I am who I am." Or in translation, oh, you don't own me. But this funny collection of people and stories that if you go back and read the Hebrew Bible again will be present to you. This broken, funny, sometimes terrible and violent and generous and beautiful collection of people working in collaboration with the holy. They keep trying to put God in a box. Literally. They make the Ark of the Covenant the literal box into which God is placed and carried into battle. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Indiana Jones movie, that's the box. And trying to put God in that box didn't work out any better for them than it did the antagonists in the movie. They would put Yahweh into that sacred container, hoist the box on their shoulders, and carry it into battle with their enemies. Then after that, the story says that the kings and rulers of Israel decided we should have a more permanent location for Yahweh. We're going to build you a temple, a really nice house where we can hold you forever. And Yahweh says to them, I don't think so. They say, no, it's going to be a really nice house. It's got pillars, a beautiful garden. You're going to love it. We'll keep you there forever and control you for our will. We know your name. And Yahweh says, you don't make houses for me. I make houses for you. And that's how it's going to be. And every time they try to do that, this holy force surprises them and says, you don't even know my name. And yet we inherited the idea that what the word God in English means for so many of us is usually male, usually old, usually white skin, usually sitting in judgment. And whether we don't believe in that or we fully believe in that, we remain convinced that we know a heck of a lot about that thing. And even if you read the book literally, it says, you don't even know my name. Try to put me in a box. So I think we've been taught the wrong questions about God, about the God project in our life, as if it's only about believing or not believing. I think God responds to questions kind of the way that light does. And I know that a physicist in the room is going to tell me I'm wrong after the service. But as I understand it, and there's always a physicist in this room. It's real hard to preach here. But as I understand it, light can behave both as a particle and as a wave. And it defies every modern law of physics we understand. You can't do that. But if we ask light a particle-type question in an experiment, it responds with a particle-type answer. And if you ask it a wave-like question in your experiment, it gives you a wave-like answer. I think that's what our encounters with God are like. If we ask it small questions, we get small answers. If we ask, do you believe in God? But there are really only two answers to that question. And to be honest with you, it's not a very interesting question to me. I've never actually had a really good discussion centered around that question. I've never grown spiritually centered around that question. I've never engaged in justice work centered around that question. In fact, I've only ever come away from the table kind of divided. Because if you ask the question, do you believe in God? There's only two answers. Yes or no. And then you have to say, well, what God are you talking about? What it doesn't ask is, what is acting like a God in your life? The God project for me is not about a question of belief. Because belief to me is a control question. It's just like what the Hebrews were trying to do. Tell me your name. I want to put you in a box. I want to build a house just for you where I can control you. Belief, to me, is exactly the same thing. Whether you believe in that God or you don't, it still presupposes that you can contain wisdom about the infinite creative source behind all creation in like a few pounds of brain matter. No way. No way. So to me, the more interesting question is not, do you believe? But what God is worthy of the service of your only life? What reality is acting like a God for you? What are you sacrificing for? Maybe it's your ego being treated like a God. I do that all the time. I have a little symbolic altar for it, and I make good sacrifices and treat it like it's worthy of my attention all the time. Maybe it's money, or your political party, or sex, or power, consumption, or simply being right. We devote countless hours, countless irreplaceable hours of our only life, spending them in the service of things which do not deserve the service and gift of our only life. For me, the question is not, do you believe, but what is worthy of spending your life for? In his book, Forrest Church talks about the fact that there are 6 or 7 kind of general ways that people have approached the holy, kind of caricatures. He gives names to them like the child. That's a person who walks through the world amazed at the beauty and wonder of existence. Everything's beautiful. There is the stargazer who stares up into a vast and mysterious universe, wondering how anything has ever become at all. That's me. There's the champion who runs headfirst into battle, working for justice matters. There is the mystic who encounters the holy on their own in their little world. And he says that each of those ways of being has a strength and a setback. The mystic does experience the holy, but they do so alone. And it doesn't really help anybody else unless they venture out. The champion on the cause for justice is always very good at working for the poor, but sometimes not very good at loving real people. The stargazer stands in awe of the universe while tragedy happens behind them. The idea is that if you have been set on asking the same set of questions about your encounters with a mystery beyond all naming, it's time to ask another question. What is worthy of the service of your one precious life? There will be a limit. There will be an exact number of cups of coffee, of conversations held, of times you hugged or kissed your child, of nights you sat down into a comfortable bed. When it is said and done, there will be a number on those things. I know a lot of us in this room avoid talk of God with people that we think are going to have a certain reaction to that discussion. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be an either or, you or me, believe or not question. The question about our relationship with the holy can be, what are you spending your life on? What's worthy of acting like a God in your life? Every time we encounter that project, that discussion, it can be in the tradition we inherited of a people whose own relationship with the holy said, you cannot put me in a box, you cannot build me a permanent house, you don't even know my name. I hope the project for you is giving you big answers. What is worthy of the love, devotion, and service of your one life? May you have huge answers. Amen.